Welcome back to the Micro-Digressions Philosophy Podcast. This is Spencer Case. So welcome to our end of the year Rant-a-thon special. I hope you really enjoy it. So if you haven't seen this before, I've been doing it since 2022. I invite a bunch of people on to give little rants, and sometimes these turn into like mini podcasts. There'll be a short back and forth about whatever the person is talking about, and it's quite fun. So this time I have got so many rants that I've broken it up into two episodes, or part one and part two of the same episode, I suppose. But this is going to be part one. Part one, you're going to have Matthew Adelstein talking about shrimp welfare, followed by Mark Oppenheimer on how the university used to be a lot better, followed by a sort of three-way conversation by Craig White, who is going to be ranting about the folly and moral badness of Ukraine's defensive war, or rather our support for it. Then Dave Baker is also part of that conversation. He's talking about the injustice of peacetime conscription. And then we end with Jason Werbeloff, who's going to be talking about misconceptions about AI. So it's going to be a very fun episode. I hope you enjoy it. I just want to say we started doing video. What am I saying we? It's just me. I've been doing video episodes just starting in 2024. I've only got 109 YouTube subscribers. So if you've got a YouTube account, go ahead and subscribe to us or to this podcast on YouTube. All right. I hope you enjoy the 2024 Rant-a-thon Part 1. Matthew Adelstein, I understand you have a rant for me.
Yes, I do. Okay. I recently released an article arguing that people should give their money to the Shrimp Welfare Project. The Shrimp Welfare Project provides electrical stunners that are used to stun shrimp before slaughter. For every dollar it gets, roughly an extra 1,500 shrimp are stunned per year, rather than it having painful deaths. The shrimp, by the way, are killed by being placed on a big thing of ice where they're slowly frozen and suffocated to death. This lasts about 20 minutes. It probably feels roughly like being placed in a suitcase without enough air so that you suffocate, and then being tossed into the North Pole so that you also freeze to death. If we assume that the stunners are used for 10 years, a conservative estimate, this means that the average dollar that they get has prevented about 15,000 painful shrimp deaths. The marginal dollar is even better, probably preventing more like 20,000 painful shrimp deaths, making it so that the shrimp deaths are painless rather than extremely painful. This is a ridiculous amount of good. The most detailed report on shrimp sentience had an average estimate that they feel pain 19% as intensely as we do. If we assume that this estimate is right, the marginal dollar given to the Shrimp Welfare Project averts about as much agony as making painless 3,800 human deaths. If pain and suffering are bad, then preventing as much agony as making 3,800 human deaths painless for just $1 is insanely high impact. It's probably the best place you can spend your money. The only real argument against it is that it sounds weird, but we'd expect the best organizations to sound weird. In response to this, lots of people on Twitter and elsewhere responded with mockery and nothing else. The main response was something along the lines of, haha, caring about shrimp, that's so ridiculous. But it would be surprising if the best charitable organizations didn't sound weird, particularly when we account for the widespread tendency of humans to err morally. In particular, for nearly all of human history, a sizable share of conscious creatures have been excluded from our moral circle, and this has led to quite profound error. We should expect that we are similarly erring, that there are creatures that we ought to morally care about, but that we are not caring. There were no real objections given by anyone to anything that was said in the article. Most people's response was simply reiterating that they don't care about shrimp, and this is the typical response to arguments for caring about shrimp welfare. Newsflash that should be obvious to everyone. Reiterating that you don't care about some group isn't an argument against caring about that group. It wouldn't do to respond to an argument against racism by saying, no, don't you understand? I'm really very racist and thus don't care about other races. No one was able to articulate what about shrimp made their suffering almost entirely morally irrelevant. Shrimp are very dumb, but if we came across humans with similar cognitive incapacities, we wouldn't think it was fine to torture them or that a charity preventing tens of thousands of them from experiencing a painful death rather than a painless one per dollar wasn't a good charity. Some people argued that pain doesn't aggregate. Lots of small pains aren't as bad as one large pain. No number of mild headaches are as bad as death. Now, this view is false, but it's also irrelevant to the shrimp welfare debate. We know very little about shrimp consciousness. So long as there's even a 1% chance that they're above a threshold, the Shrimp Welfare Project comes out very effective. If we accept that shrimp suffer on average 19% as intensely as humans, which is the mean estimate of by far the most detailed report on shrimp consciousness compiled by Rethink Priorities, then they're almost definitely above the threshold. And in my view, this report is actually an underestimate. This was a point that I made in the article. Virtually no one addressed it. The overwhelming response involved ignoring the arguments and simply replying with scorn. Few of the people heaping scorn on the Shrimp Welfare Project were willing to defend their views in a debate. When one of them accepted my debate challenge, he ended up biting the bullet on the conclusion that spending a penny to shut down a factory that creates and then tortures mentally disabled babies to death would not be very valuable. When those opposed to shrimp welfare have to actually defend their ideas in a debate or explain where the arguments for caring about shrimp welfare goes wrong, their views begin to look monstrously implausible. Every response to the arguments for caring about shrimp welfare was complete rubbish. Yet despite this, the Shrimp Welfare Project has a shoestring budget of just a few $100,000. People give almost no money to it. It's routinely derided and mocked. It's not like giving to the Shrimp Welfare Project is particularly counterintuitive. If you could spend a penny giving 200 lobsters painless deaths rather than having them boil alive, that would be a good use of a penny. Similarly, a penny that prevented 200 shrimp from painfully freezing and suffocating to death would be well spent. But that's what every penny given to the Shrimp Welfare Project does. If you're going to deride something that is potentially an immense opportunity to do huge amounts of good, you should have something convincing to say about why it's bad. Unfortunately, nearly none of the critics of shrimp welfare had that. All they had was scorn and mockery.
Thank you, Matthew. Very interesting. Do you think it would be wrong for me to give my money instead to some other charity that doesn't have the same utility, bang for the buck? You know, like suppose I'm giving money to GiveWell or someplace like that. I don't think the Shrimp Welfare Charity is on their list of charities. Would you go so far as to say that's the wrong decision, or it's a bad decision, or deeply suboptimal decision?
It's certainly deeply suboptimal, and it's certainly bad in relative terms. Whether it's wrong is a more complicated question, because it might be that like donations above a certain threshold are merely supererogatory. And so now, I'm sort of inclined to think supererogation isn't fundamental, and that really, the fundamental normative facts are just about reasons and about our strength of reasons. So I'd say give really strong reasons to give to the Shrimp Welfare Project, and maybe that's where the moral facts kind of bottom out. But then I think, there are, like, I'm sort of a moral non-naturalist about reasons facts, and then a moral naturalist about certain other kinds of facts, like obligations. So I think, facts about obligation, for instance, are sort of these, linguistically constructed entities that, kind of could conceivably differ from society to society if there were different, reference fixing facts. But yeah, I would say it's deeply suboptimal. It's true GiveWell doesn't recommend them, because the charities that GiveWell recommends are charities helping humans. They're focused on the global health scene. But I think the Shrimp Welfare Project is just much higher impact. So it costs about $5,000 to save a life. For $5,000, you can either save one human or about 75 million shrimp from a painful death. And so unless you give no weight to shrimp, you should think that saving the shrimp is more valuable. If you have a 1% credence in shrimp being deserving a small amount of weight, the Shrimp Welfare Project ends up just winning out by a huge margin. Now, it is sort of initially counterintuitive to think that the Shrimp Welfare Project is the best place. I think the argument for marginal cases shows that there is not any principal justification for showing extreme disregard to animals. And so just like if you could prevent 75 million cognitively enfeebled humans from painfully dying for $5,000, that would be better than giving to GiveWell. I think the same thing about the shrimp.
Okay, so every shrimp has a 20-minute death that's 19% roughly as painful as a human death. So you think that preventing 75 million of those easily outweighs the value of a whole human life saved?
Yeah. Now, I should be clear, the 19% estimate is not some like highly precise number. There's lots of uncertainty going into the number. So this is the mean estimate, but the actual estimate, it might be zero. It might be that shrimp aren't conscious. I think our best evidence points to they are, or it might be that the extent of their consciousness is quite a bit more than this.
So let me ask you this. If you had the choice between living out your full human life or a million years of a relatively painless shrimp life, do you think it would be better for you to choose the shrimp life, having that level of sentience? Like, would you forfeit the remaining, I don't know, 50 to 80 years of your life for a million years of a relatively benign shrimp life?
So I'm a theist, so I think probably, your life brings about various great afterlife goods. But insofar as it turns out that theism is false, then yes, I think you should do that. But note, I don't think this is essential for the argument, because you don't have to think that like lots of shrimp being happy is more important than a human life. All you need to think is lots of shrimp being in intense agony is seriously and morally important and comparable to humans. But then that's sort of, that's not that counterintuitive. Like if you imagine, if you just think about it, spending $1 to prevent 20,000 shrimp from painfully dying, that seems like a pretty good use of the $1. In total, that $1 prevents, if I'm doing the math right, about, well, actually, I'm not going to do the math, but it prevents a lot of suffering.
I guess I'm willing to go with you insofar as, yeah, the shrimp have to have some amount of moral weight in as much as they're capable of suffering. I think Bentham was right about that. And I think once you admit that, there's no avoiding some amount of counterintuitive conclusions. I think that's just unavoidable. I do wonder, however, whether you think it's possible that although pleasure can be commensurate across species, that might not be true for all goods. Like it might be the case that there's like something called meaning that humans have in their mortal lives that is inaccessible to shrimp. And it might be that the meaning goods are like much more important than pure utility, or maybe somehow they interact with one another. So human utility is worth more because of its interaction with these other goods.
So I think that, this might be right. It might be that a human's life is significantly more valuable than a shrimp's life. Well, I think that is true, in part because there are certain great goods that a human can have that a shrimp can't. So, for example, I'm inclined to think that at least one of the goods that are of significant value in a person's life are the good of relationships, and I think shrimp probably can't have any very valuable relationships. Now, in the case of the Shrimp Welfare Project, it averts extreme shrimp suffering. But my view is that your suffering, the badness of your suffering, doesn't depend on your species, right? So if it were about saving lives, then this would be relevant. But insofar as it's just about averting extreme suffering, I don't think your species affects the badness of your suffering. And even if this makes it like just the numbers are so insane that even if you have an argument for why helping out humans is better by a factor of 4 or 5, it'll just be swamped by the ridiculous cost effectiveness of the Shrimp Welfare Project.
Yeah, so I guess if you're an anti-realist, you can always say, well, in the end of the day, I just don't care about that, and that's just supposed to be the final word. And I'm a realist, I guess, because I don't think that's the final word. I think you ought to care about certain things, whether you do or not.
Yeah, but I think even if you're an anti-realist, it may be that in fact you don't care about shrimp. But I think the right kind of anti-realism will hold that when deciding what things to care about, they should at least, be somewhat non-arbitrary, or that maybe the things that you would care about upon reflection. And I think when you really reflect, very few humans are psychologically constituted to think that what really matters is like, in terms of determining your moral worth, is like what you look like. And I think if when you reflect on why we think that shrimp basically are deserving of zero weight, like really the difference is basically they look different, given that if you had a human with a shrimp brain, we would not think that it was fine. We would not think that a charity that prevented billions of them from painfully dying was an obvious joke.
Matthew Adelstein doing great work in arguing about theism, arguing about all kinds of things, and making much older philosophers look comparatively lazy. So I appreciate your work.
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. Thanks for having me on.
You know what grinds my gears? I went to university during an absolute golden age, and I didn't realize it. I studied at the University of Cape Town in the early 2000s. It was one of the most fabulous environments for free inquiry, with professors who were dedicated to finding out what's true, presenting students with a variety of different ideas in a space that was largely apolitical, that one wasn't expected to toe a particular line in order to do well, that as a lecturer, you were largely given free rein to design your own syllabus, that you could explore both sides of a debate, that there was no expectation that you held an unorthodox view that you would be punished for it. And all of that has changed. Unfortunately, universities have become spaces where I think students and staff both live in fear that they will step on an invisible landmine, that they will express support for a view that becomes unfashionable, and that instead of doing rigorous analysis, universities have become places for political activism. This has manifested in quite significant ways this year in the shutdowns of campuses at Columbia and throughout America because of the students engaging in protest action around Israel and Gaza. Now, universities could have played an important role in this conflict. They could have brought in international law experts who could have given both sides of the debate, enlightened students about what the standards are for the laws of war, for genocide, looking at prior cases where states have been held liable for genocide, looking at the history of Israel, history of Palestine. But instead, university seems to have surrendered their spaces to activists who held a very strong view, that you had encampments which appeared to have been subsidized by outsiders because many students had identical tents. They were provided with signs they didn't know the meaning of. So students when asked, what does spread the intifada globally mean? They had no idea what an intifada was. When they were asked from which river and to which sea would you like Palestine to be free, they had no idea. But they'd seen that a cause was fashionable. They wanted to align themselves with that. And the concern with that breakdown in intellectual rigor at universities is that you end up having a vacuum, and that vacuum gets filled by pernicious forces. I must say that the University of Cape Town, where I studied, played some role in this change in universities. So in 2015, a campaign was launched under the rubric of Rhodes Must Fall, referring to the imperialist and mining magnate Cecil John Rhodes. So Rhodes had provided an enormous amount of money to the university, and the campus was built on one of his parcels of land. And there was a big statue of Rhodes in the center of the campus, and students, in an effort to decolonize the space, eventually succeeded in having the statue removed. But that was only the beginning of their decolonial project. They would go on to rip art off the walls and burn it. The fervor that the students engaged in their cause with spread from South Africa to Oxford, where many of the fallists called for statues of Rhodes to be removed out there. And statues were torn down in 2020 in America. And this idea that students need to play a role in fighting for political causes as opposed to studying and hearing a variety of views seems to have taken hold. In 2016, UCT had cancelled a quite famous academic freedom lecture in the Orwellian claim that it would retard the cause of academic freedom to include the speaker being Fleming Rose, who was the editor of the newspaper Yilgarn's Postins. Rose had done the brave thing of publishing images of the Prophet Muhammad in his newspaper at a time when there were attacks against cartoonists for doing so. And the Academic Freedom Committee at the University of Cape Town thought that it would be important to allow someone like that to speak on campus. And because of threats against the university, the speech was cancelled. And this was repeated again recently when the CEO of German newspaper Bild, Sebastian Senst, was to give a talk, a very prestigious talk at the University of Cape Town, and this was again cancelled on the basis that there was public pressure. And the worry is that when universities cede space to activists, to say that, well, if people's feelings are going to be hurt or this is an unpopular decision, well, then they'll capitulate. They cede the space for academic freedom, and they no longer become a place of open inquiry. Now, there has been an upshot to universities going down this path, which is that there's much more room for independent people to be able to set up their own spaces where people can discuss whatever they want. So on brand of that, we've hosted over 200 philosophers over the years. We've spoken to people about all sorts of weird and wonderful things. And a lot of those academics have felt that this is an environment where they can really test their ideas. That we, first of all, try and understand what their position is before jumping down their throats. So we ask lots of clarifying questions. And then we try and put up the best possible objections so that the idea can be tested, regardless of our own beliefs. And Spencer does a wonderful job of doing that on Micro-Digressions. And there is something wonderful about this independent space of podcasters and YouTubers who are making the ideas that were once held in an ivory tower accessible to people all around the world. If you can't afford to spend $100,000 a year at Vanderbilt for free, you can hear wonderful things from incredible thinkers on YouTube and Spotify. But there is a sense in which if the universities keep going down this path, they're going to cede a lot of ground to independents. And it's good that the independents are able to spread their ideas, host civil debates. But it would be nice if the universities could return to their former glory and ensure that they become places of inquiry instead of places of mere political action.
All right, now I'm here to hear the rants of Craig White, followed by Dave Baker. So, Craig, you were on earlier to talk about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You gave a morally sane defense of the Palestinian cause. I understand you've got another foreign policy controversy to talk to us about today.
That's right, and it's again an ethical issue. This one might be even less popular, I don't know.
Well, let's hear it.
The subject of my rant is two sets of ongoing acts of very serious evil related to the launching and continuation of war, both tied in different ways to extreme folly. The folly and the evil are closely related, as I will briefly explain. The field of action comprises Russia, Ukraine, the US, and NATO. My framework is Aristotelian Thomist just war theory, and my background includes diplomatic and other work in the Middle East and Africa. I want to talk about Ukraine. At the outset, I'm not really happy with my own position. Intellectually happy, but not emotionally happy. This is a painful topic for me due to personal and even religious connections to Ukraine and a decades-long interest in her independence and in her past suffering. I think about and, in fact, pray for Ukraine daily. I'm going to state my thesis and then consider some objections that I'm sure will be raised. My thesis is this. The U.S. is currently involved in two sets of seriously evil acts, both involving extreme folly. The first concerns our encouragement of Ukraine to defy Russia's clear, repeated, and escalating warnings since at least 2008 and to pursue NATO membership. This continued into 2022 when those warnings included a clear threat of war to prevent it. War that would strike not at Crimea, but at the Ukrainian heartland. Here, the foolish and thus evil decisions were Ukraine's, but strong pressure, interference, and encouragement came from the U.S. This U.S. involvement was also foolish and evil. The second set of actions is directly that of the U.S., the funding and supplying and direct aiding of this defensive war, without which it would have ended in extremely short order. Ukraine had no capacity on its own to fight the much larger Russia and would have been forced to sue for peace in short order. I see two aspects of our actions that are evil. First, because of Russia's nuclear arsenal and our leftover prudence from the Cold War and mutually assured destruction, this defensive war by Ukraine with our heavy involvement was unwinnable, without extreme risk of blowing up human civilization and perhaps destroying Earth's ecosystem through nuclear war. Technically, it thus violated one of 6 traditional ad bellum just war criteria, reasonable chance of success. Second, because it was unwinnable in any reasonable or likely scenario, it obviously was extremely likely to cause many untimely deaths and great human misery. Now, if these were likely to be outweighed by some great human good, that would be one thing. The case would be reasonably made or could be reasonably made for the war, especially given its defensive nature. But when the likely outcome is great loss and little or no gain, another criterion of just war theory is violated, proportionality of ends. Both of these criteria concern the Aristotelian Thomist virtue of prudence in the broad sense of wisdom in action. I'll just say a few words about prudence. While in modern ethical thought, prudence is not very important, for Thomas Aquinas, no action can be good unless it is first prudent or wise. The reason is that human action is the art of the possible. No matter how good your stated goals are, if there is no practical way to achieve them, those goals cannot justify your acts. And acts of war are acts of force, which is never the ideal way to conduct human affairs. Good and evil are often mixed in human affairs, but to achieve great evil with no hope of good is simply evil. The good to be preserved in war is not only independence, but the lives and well-being of citizens. A double failure is in the offing. More of the territory of Ukraine looks certain to be lost as a result of fighting rather than early negotiating, and probably hundreds of thousands of lives have been and will be lost. The mentally and physically wounded, as well as the dead, soldiers as well as civilians. The country has been well nigh destroyed. Concessions will be made, but not gains. Objection 1. Ukraine had and has a right to join NATO. It is morally wrong of Russia to try to prevent that. My response. In an abstract sense, all of our personal rights and the rights of our states are more or less unlimited, but in practice, many of them cannot be exercised. The U.S. of all nations cannot make this claim without hypocrisy because the U.S. long ago announced the Monroe Doctrine of an exclusive right to interfere in the nations of the Western Hemisphere. In great power history, the U.S. pushed the world to the brink of nuclear war in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because of its proximity to us, we would not allow it to be an effective part of a Russian-led alliance, despite some deep water between us and Cuba. Furthermore, a thought experiment. If Mexico attempted to join a Russia or China-led military alliance, it is impossible to honestly believe that the U.S. would not intervene militarily if other pathways to preventing this failed. Ukraine, rather than being separated by an ocean as Cuba is from us, has a long land frontier with Russia. Objection 2. Ukraine's war is clearly defensive, and just war theory means that should be enough to justify the war. Response. In my 2010 book, I was close to stating this position, but did not consider it in detail. I would say there is a presumption of justice in a truly defensive war, and Ukraine's qualifies. But the choice facing the state is important. Both Soviet and now Russian post-communist history do not display a strong expansionist tendency in foreign policy. There was and is no indication of a Russian intention to rule Ukraine as a whole, to slaughter or enslave Ukrainians for the sake of domination, or to completely deprive it of choice in foreign relations. While I do not offer any justification for the Russian invasion, the Russian demand for Ukraine to stay out of NATO and respect the Russian-speaking people of the Ukrainian East are not extraordinary in the history of great power relations with neighboring states, including U.S. history. After the Second World War, the USSR insisted on Austria and also Finland remaining militarily neutral while cultivating close economic and cultural ties to the West. But these countries flourished in that period despite the restriction. This does not appear to have been an existential choice for Ukraine, and thus I believe the reasoning of just war theory ad bellum criteria clearly applies. Objection 3. If only the U.S. had fully supported Ukraine militarily, this war could have been quickly won at a low cost in human lives. Ukraine showed a tremendous fighting spirit and what they could have done with real support. We're far stronger than Russia militarily, and they would not have gambled the fate of the planet by escalating to nuclear weapons. My response. The key issue here is the nuclear weapons coupled with the unpredictability of war in general. Hamas leaders believed they could get away with a limited strike on Israel, followed by some military punishment from Israel, and then negotiations for the hostages. At considerable risk, Israel escalated enormously. The U.S. entered into a limited involvement in a conflict in Vietnam. It escalated enormously. World War I began with Austria's very reasonable attempt to punish Serbia for its involvement in an outrageous political assassination. The logic of escalation is illogical. When one's fellow citizens die in a war, emotions overwhelm calculation, and the desire for a military response becomes irresistible to political leaders. Each minor escalation ignites hurricanes of emotion, which tends to trigger the next escalation, and the chain is very hard to break for each side. U.S. weapons, apparently requiring U.S. involvement to strike their targets, have already been fired into the Russian homeland, causing Russian casualties. The emotional response in Russia to such attacks is incalculable. When the downside risk is not just a world war with 10 million deaths or so, as in World War I, but the destruction of the planet as a hospitable home, it behooves all all sides not to gamble with nuclear weapons. Proxy wars with the USSR never included attempts to bring a state on the USSR's border, much less the Russian border, into an anti-USSR or anti-Russian military alliance, nor did they include the firing of non-nuclear US missiles into Russian territory. Thus, such proxy wars like Afghanistan are not credible counterexamples. Mutual assured destruction has a very ugly sound, but no one has come up with a better solution to the problem of nuclear weapons. The rule is, do not attack a nuclear power. There we go.
Dave, do you have any thoughts or comments on Craig's rant?
I'm so glad you asked. I do have thoughts. So like I should begin by saying I feel like I'm probably an unusually sympathetic audience to this because my mindset about foreign matters, especially where nuclear adversaries are concerned, is very risk averse. And I think that the US has certainly proceeded in a way that isn't sufficiently risk averse when it comes to the situation in Ukraine. So I'm gonna I have a lot of kind of agreement with a lot of what you say, and I'm maybe going to be playing a little bit devil's advocate here. Actually, I mean, one thing maybe I think there's a good chance that the issue of NATO was a kind of decisive factor for Russia in deciding to make the attack. And that, I mean, especially I think it's very likely that if things had never started down the path of Ukraine and NATO talking about Ukraine maybe joining, that it's very likely that the war would never have happened. Although there were like a lot of other things that kind of were then other factors, I think, in the war happening. But like, I guess one thing to say is it feels like the realistic position to me, and maybe it's just that the Russians either didn't feel this way or weren't willing to kind of take the risk about it. The realistic position to me seems to be that promises that Ukraine might eventually get into NATO were kind of a pipe dream, and that it was never going to happen, realistically speaking. So I guess that's one, it's like people were talking a lot about it, but I'm a little uncertain about, I'm highly uncertain. In fact, I think it's more likely than not that it never would have really happened, or at least it wouldn't have happened during a period of time in which, like it might happen down the road if we get into a position where Russia would not be opposed to it. But I kind of doubt that realistically it would have happened if things had continued on the road that they were on and the war hadn't occurred, if that makes sense.
I can see that, but I would just say that from 2008 to 2022, the U.S. went out of its way over and over to assure the world that Ukraine was on the pathway to NATO entry. And also, just in practical terms, a lot of what that entails, a lot of that pathway entails increasing military cooperation, military training, supplying of U.S.-made weapons, supplying of NATO weapons, training in all those weapons. And in the end, the question of formal NATO membership might even be a moot point if you can slide the camel nose first under the edge of the tent. You may not have ever allowed the camel to enter, but it's there, to use a Middle Eastern proverb. Yeah, I can see that, and as I said very briefly, I'm not justifying the invasion, but I do think when a great power makes a really strong point in very strong terms and says over and over, this is a red line, we will not accept this. It doesn't deserve to. It should not be treated with contemptuous disregard for its wishes, and I think that is what happened. We treated them with contemptuous disregard for their concerns.
Yeah. I mean, I think I absolutely agree with that, and also, I guess, again, I guess to get to a thing that I kind of like said as a caveat to my objection, right? Even if they shouldn't have been too confident that Ukraine was going to get in, they also weren't in a position to be super confident that they weren't going to get into NATO. And that's, I mean, I guess the other kind of thing to say is, given that we're talking about these kind of like chance of success and kind of consequential factors of fighting the war, it's not super clear to me, I guess, that there was a strong chance or much of a chance at all of the sort of Ukrainian um like so it feels like the kind of thing that would have made nuclear escalation likely would be a big success on Ukraine's part, like they look like they're going to retake Crimea or they start to do that or something like that. And you know, it feels a little bit like that was never a realistic possibility. Again, like they just didn't. And so maybe you could say, well, the right way to defend the war would be as a way of, on the one hand, displaying that there is a price to be paid for the kind of action that Russia took, and thereby kind of like reinforcing deterrence against cross-border war in Europe. And then kind of in the second, putting Ukraine in a position to get a better negotiated deal with Russia after, because like, even though Ukraine's not in a great position now, they're in a better position than we would have expected them to ever get to when the war was starting. And so, it seems like in that sense, one of the objectives of the war has been sort of, partially achieved anyway, of putting Ukraine in a better bargaining position to end up getting more of what they would want in a negotiated ceasefire or peace or something like that. So I guess those are kind of two factors that make me, again, like my personal inclination is to think, I'm not necessarily going to judge the Ukrainians, but like my personal inclination is to think that it might have been better for the US to stay out of this way more than we did, at least. But maybe that kind of deterrence factor and the factor of helping the Ukrainians to get a better deal at the end of a war that they end up kind of losing but not entirely losing, maybe those things are kind of good reasons to fight.
That sounds like a bit like Finland in the Winter War in 1940 or 40 to 41, I guess. But I mean, you may be right. A lot of these are counterfactuals. I think that from what I understand, the ability of Ukraine to take back any part of its territory is like entirely dependent on the U.S. on U.S. support. From what I understand, we pay basically the salaries of their government. We pay a great deal of their ongoing expenses, as well as supplying them with almost everything they need militarily, except bodies. And so part of that, what that does is it says the reality of the war is that NATO, and especially the US, is at war with Russia on Ukrainian territory. And that, of course, is problematic. But I would say, secondly, that Russia had, a small piece of eastern Ukraine. And I don't want to justify aggression, but my understanding is Ukraine was not treating its Russian-speaking citizens terribly well and was not honoring the Minsk Accords, which Angela Merkel just recently said she'd never expected them to, and didn't take that very seriously, which is odd, awkward, not very good for diplomacy. But I think Russia's actual holding of territory was much smaller than it is. And in addition, my idea about the logic of escalation has already taken place to a great extent. So Russian emotions are profoundly aggravated. Donald Trump's ego is now involved. I don't, he wants to end this, but he also doesn't want to look like a patsy. So how much does he have to stand up and try to show firmness simply because the U.S. is involved, but I am extremely dubious that the Russians aim to back up from where they are. I think they're going to say, hey, we gained this territory with blood and money while you did your best to stop us. And these are Russian speakers, like the vast majority of the ones in the territory we've claimed. You forced us into this horrible position, which we are, whether you agree with that or not. And so the logic of escalation has already pushed Russia into a place where it does not want to back down. Certainly, it's not going to give up Crimea. I'm very dubious that it will give up any of eastern Ukraine. So I think we're in a real bind. There's a kind of an energy well that you get into in war that drives groups of nations into more and more commitment of losses and more chasing after sunk costs until there's gigantic losses on all sides. And so I see your points, but I'm dubious.
Yeah, I wish I could confidently disagree, but like I was saying, right, I think there's a good chance you're just right about this.
I think I put the point to you that might doesn't make right, but might makes a good part of prudence, and prudence does in fact bear on what's right.
Yeah, and that's a kind of I think when I go from sort of Kantian ethics in grad school to Aristotelian Thomist ethics, Aristotle and Thomas are very clear about this, about looking at possibilities and possible outcomes, and the fact that when evil is mixed with good, you have to have some expectations in mind. And yeah, sometimes the best you can hope for against the bully is a lot less than you would expect. I think that's true. There are possibilities in life, and Ukraine being a great power is not one of them, and Ukraine being fully independent of the interests of Russia is not one of them, any more than Canada's possibilities of being utterly independent of U.S. interests do not exist.
All right. So let's move on to Dave's rant. Looking forward to it. What is your rant on again, Dave?
Yeah, so I think you successfully convinced me not to just make it about Trump because, my original idea was to just complain about the election results, but I don't think I have anything original to say about that. Um, just all you Trump voters out there know that if things do go the wrong direction with things in Ukraine, I'm going to blame you. But so I wanted to talk about the something that I've thought about kind of writing a little paper about over the years, but it's just like you never find the time for all your ideas, I feel like. And this is one where I feel very confident in it, and I feel like it's a little more provocative than a lot of thoughts that I have, which is the immorality of compulsory government service, including peacetime drafts. So, there's a lot of countries that that have conscription during peacetime, like Switzerland. Germany used to do it, but I guess they don't anymore, right? But I think Austria still does. Israel does, but that's kind of a funny case because Israel is obviously, when is it ever truly peacetime in Israel? But like South Korea would be another example. So I have a very strong gut feeling, and I think the arguments for it are good as well, that this type of compulsory service where the government says you are ordered to put a year or two of your life into this activity that we choose, which is often kind of serving in the military, but it might be a social service thing or something. And often pacifists are given the opportunity to do social service instead. But even so, I think that this is just wildly wrong. Like it's one of the, for the countries that do it, I think it's one of the worst infringements of autonomy that happen in liberal democracies in the world today. And I'm very proud of the United States for not doing it anymore. I guess Milton Friedman was pivotal in getting the peacetime draft taken away in the United States. And I think that was a heroic act for the American people. So the arguments that I have, I don't think they're especially creative. I think they're pretty straightforward once you see what's de facto kind of going on with these forced selective service things. I think they're highly analogous to something like imprisonment and forced labor. People are told, with whatever legal penalty there is, you've got to do this. You've got to dedicate however a year of your life, 2 years of your life, whatever, to this activity that we choose. And sometimes it's an activity that carries dangers, but even when it's not, um, I think that's an extremely severe infringement of autonomy of the sort that I think, for example, I don't buy the argument that taxation is a kind of theft or anything. I don't agree with that at all. But I think that if you were to take that kind of argument and apply it here, this truly is a kind of theft of a year or two of your life, and a very severe kind of pretty arbitrary restriction on what activities are you choosing to engage in with your precious time. It has extremely unequal and unpredictable costs on the people who are subject to it. So for some people, they're going to be doing it at a juncture in their life when they don't have anything else in particular going on, and maybe it's quite beneficial to them even. And this is part of why some people argue for this, I think. But for some people, they're going to be doing it at a year of their life when maybe one of their parents is ill, or it's a crucial year in an important relationship in their life. Like maybe they just met the person of their dreams, and they want to take their time to develop this relationship, and instead they're being told, here's where you need to go, here's what you need to do for the next period of time. And that could have the side effect even of ruining that relationship, or maybe they're at a key juncture in preparing for or undertaking their career, and they're forced to delay that for X amount of time. The impacts of this, depending on the specifics of different people's situations, are going to be vastly unequal. And there's not going to be any way in practice to have a system that does a just job of giving exemptions to all the people who justly should have exemptions from this kind of thing, because the number of specific life circumstances that are going to be meritorious reasons to ask for an exemption are so great, right? There's so many things that I think would justly justify an exemption from this. Personal crises, family health problems, those kind of things. There's not any objective way to measure the significance of those considerations, but those are the kind of considerations I think that should be grounds for exemption from something like this. So any system like this is going to have major systemic problems of injustice in terms of just the inability to implement something that would let off the people who should be let off. And, again, to kind of reiterate something perhaps that I've already said, I just think this is an incredibly invasive offense against your autonomy to take away your self-determination over a year or more of your life. This is a core liberty. What are you doing with your time? It's not fungible in the way that money is. So again, I don't think it's defensible in the way that taxation is defensible. And it's also not kind of constitutively core to the operation of a government at all in the way that taxation is. So I just don't think that significant defenses of this are really viable, and it just seems to me to be an atrocious wrong on behalf of the countries that do it. I've had people, including like fellow progressives, tell me, this is a great thing. The countries that do it, it integrates people into the society. It makes everybody give their contribution to the greater whole. I don't accept that kind of argument at all. I think this is really wrong, and the countries that do it should stop doing it.
So you might have known this, but in World War I, about that time, I think during World War I, the Supreme Court heard a case about whether a wartime draft violates the 13th Amendment. And they claimed that it didn't, like that essentially a draft was not a form of slavery. but it was extremely special pleading kind of reasoning, it seemed to me. I could look up exactly what it said. I think it was an Oliver Wendell Holmes decision, and it was this sort of like, oh well, we all know that's different. That's for the common good. That's not what that meant. But like, no, really, this does seem like forced labor, and it's not for prison. It's not any kind of punishment. So it really does seem like it should be unconstitutional. So, do you feel differently about like a kind of draft, like on a moral level, like a draft that's for a particular crisis?
But yeah, I mean, I definitely do. And I think that is, I think that the defenses available for that are much, more, I would say even that I don't have the same intuition about a draft with an acute crisis, but that seems to me to be of a piece with the kind of issues surrounding what's called like the supreme emergency exemption for the laws of warfare, right? That sometimes in order to defend the institutions that protect our liberty and autonomy, you need to kind of suspend some of the norms that protect those rights in order to, at the end of the day, end up with a solid defense or protection for those institutions. It needs to be something that's done for a particular acute and circumscribed kind of period of time or place or something like that. But and honestly, I think there's significant ethical mysteries surrounding exactly what the justification is for these emergency exemptions. And I think it's just the things that people say are very suggestive, like the thing that I just said, that you need to protect the institutions that defend rights in order for rights to have any meaning or something like that. I think that's very suggestive. I also think it's far from being a knockdown, rock solid piece of reasoning. And I think there's just a huge amount of territory here for people to work in to try to figure out what is the justification for emergency exemptions from liberties. But I mean, my conscience tells me when I ask for what Rawls would call like my considered judgments about cases, my conscience tells me that it is okay to have those kind of acute exemptions in a crisis, even though I feel like I don't have a good understanding at all of what is the actual ethical justification for that.
I do get the sense that there is a meaningful difference between an emergency measure and then just not having a liberty, generally speaking, as just a normal backdrop of our civic life. Craig, do you have any thoughts on this?
Craig,
When I was working on my PhD, I started out as a kind of a libertarian with a weird Thomism attached to it, but it was the Thomism and the Aristotelianism that gradually eroded my libertarianism. But I still have a lot of sympathy for the arguments for individual autonomy. But one of the things I noticed just in my studies was that it seemed like liberal individualists had a hard time even justifying national defense. People like David Roden and Jeff McMahon had a hard time really justifying in terms of their liberal individualism, even the right of a country to defend itself. And I think that was part of what pushed me to think about the common good arguments more. I mean, for me, the classic Thomist answer is in part that we are who we are in large part because of the goods that we share in that are common. So we like to think of roads and clean water and military and a police force or something as, constituting. But a Thomist might say, well, the fact that there's an education system, the fact that you have a culture, the fact that you have a language and art and a shared history is all part of who you are. And you are part of something that's larger than yourself, which is anathema. And it feels funny to say it, but you really are part of something that's bigger than yourself, and you wouldn't be who you are without those things. So I don't want to actually take a position on whether the compulsion. I think I would say about the exemptions that we can't do them equally. I would be tempted to reply with Chesterton, if a thing is worth doing, it's worth doing badly. It's worth doing imperfectly. I do think that maybe socially and intellectually we have tended in America to a kind of extreme valuing of our individual rights in isolation from the kinds of obligations we have to others that make the rights real, or that make them sane. I have progressive friends. One was trying to tell me about like Second Amendment rights. Well, all rights are circumscribed, they're always limited. And I was like, yeah, that's true. I mean, I believe in some kind of restrictions on gun rights for sure. So I think maybe one argument would be, and I think you mentioned it briefly, just a sense of who you are, that you're not just a person in a vacuum who sprang from the head of Zeus, who's entitled to pursue all of your life projects. You're also part of something bigger. You are the good things you are because of sacrifices other people have made and are making in many cases. And to be reminded of that alone might be a very useful thing, maybe for the social fabric of a democratic society. That's a little wishy-washy, but I think an argument can be mounted against your claim, despite my emotional resonance with it. I hate the idea of somebody taking away 2 years of my life and forcing me to join the Peace Corps or whatever it is, or the War Corps.
Yeah. I mean, I think like that's similar to the kinds of defenses that friends of mine have raised of it over the years. Just the feeling like you're kind of part of the society. And I mean, I think it's fair to say that that's something that has kind of been eroded in a lot of nations, including the United States. I mean, it's not so clear to me that nations that have selective service do that much better on this count than we do. Like, I mean, South Korea is looking pretty divided at the moment,
Yeah.
for example. Fingers crossed. I don't mean to laugh at a very serious predicament that they have going on there. So yeah, I guess like, I mean, I guess the way that I just replied gets to what I think of as kind of a concern that I have about a lot of these maybe justifications of policies that are in a kind of communitarian spirit or social fabric kind of thoughts, which is I'm often very uncertain about the empirical basis for those ideas, in the sense that like it's not so clear to me that as a matter of human psychology, these kind of things have the effect that they're supposed to have according to these pictures of the fabric of society. And like, if maybe they do, maybe they don't. I don't mean to say that I have strong evidence that they don't, but it feels to me like the burden of proof required to show that they have those effects should be fairly high if you're going to justify again, kind of infringements on very core autonomies in order to pursue those goals.
Hold on. Craig, I've muted you. Go ahead. Wait. Still not.
How about now?
Okay, good.
Okay, sorry. I would like to offer a couple of analogies. I mean, personally, I think marriage is one area where autonomy gets limited severely in order for the marriage as a whole to do well, for the couple as a whole to do well. I would say parenthood is another kind of area where in order for the family to do well. Parents make severe sacrifices of their autonomy. And then you can also say in such cases, well, those sacrifices become constituted of who you are, and you're actually maybe, at least arguably, a better person for being part of this greater whole through the sacrifices. I mean, I would offer one other kind of analogy, which is I think of Greek city-states and a lot of small states or tribes or groups throughout history where if they were going to survive, it might require everyone who could carry a weapon to get out there. There's obviously the bad side of that. There's the Vikings and the the various raiders and all the tribal warfare where you want to oppose it. But at the same time, to prevent yourself from losing all your cattle, to prevent yourself from losing your resources or possibly being enslaved by somebody, everyone had to come together. And so in order to be a citizen of some small city-state, you were on the hook for helping build the wall, for helping dig certain defensive fortifications, for getting out there with your shield and spear. And you can say, well, we've graduated from that. And yet I would say, well, maybe we have, but maybe being enmeshed in history and human limitation continues to involve required sacrifices of autonomy at times. I mean, I continue to be sympathetic with trying to limit them.
Yeah, good. I mean, that feels. I'm not the world's biggest fan of Rawls on the whole in terms of like the kind of foundation of his political philosophy, but a thing that I thought was insightful about Rawls was that he would make the qualification that his liberalism applied to societies that met favorable conditions, where like, you know, it was achievable in practice that the liberal society have kind of equal basic liberties. And yeah, I mean, I think that clearly in some sense for a large stretch of history, civilizations weren't able to meet favorable conditions. And so, you know, the idea of having like a really liberal society back in, you know, ancient times or something might be an unrealistic standard to hold them to or something. So I guess that's probably, but yeah, I mean, it's definitely a good point that there's not a bright line to draw between those times and our times, even though there's a lot of difference between those times and our times.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. I'd like to continue this, but I should also tell you that like I cannot, I've got so many little rants I want to get in. I might not be able to include all of this, but thank you for doing this. And interesting rants.
Thank you.
Thanks for including me.
You know what upsets me, Spencer? Thank you for giving me this platform to moan and rant. Is people's views on AI. Not everyone's, because the people who agree with me don't make me angry, but the people who don't do. There seems to be a lot of skepticism about AI, and the skepticism seems to warp reality in certain cases. People just don't seem to understand what it is in other cases, and they also seem to have some very weird ethical views on it. So I just want to go through these because no one seems to be listening to me. So how don't they understand it, and how is their view warped? Well, let's start with warping. It seems like the people who claim that AI is useless don't understand what it can do. So just a straight example of why AI is useful is I run an advertising agency in addition to the Brain in a Vat podcast with Mark Oppenheimer. And for my advertising agency, I used to employ a copywriter to write advertising copy for my clients. And that copywriter would take about a day to write a campaign for a client. I now use ChatGPT for that function, and ChatGPT can push out advertising copy that's better quality than my copywriter in about 5 minutes. And what that has allowed me to do is to massively increase my number of clients, because I can push out copy in a few hours for 30 or 40 clients. Now, skeptics will say, well, that advertising copy is not better. I'm exaggerating, or it's incorrect. It's false, what I'm saying, that copy is as good as human written copy. But that's simply not true, because we can measure how good advertising copy is. When I run these advertising campaigns, we can see what the results of those campaigns are. We have numbers on the effectiveness of these campaigns. We see what the cost per impression is, how many people click, etc. And ChatGPT can consistently outperform a copywriter on these campaigns. So the amount of time that it saves is absolutely massive, and the amount of money. I couldn't afford to hire lots of copywriters, and I couldn't afford the risk in the loss of quality in using lots of copywriters. And now I can use just one ChatGPT. In fact, I now hire a copywriter to use ChatGPT. So there's just a very simple application of how useful ChatGPT is. But it goes well beyond the advertising world. ChatGPT or other AIs like Midjourney can produce incredible imagery. And again, you see people sniffing and snubbing up their noses at the quality of that work and saying it's no good. But that, again, is empirically false. We see that images that have been created by even early versions of Midjourney, the image AI version, the image producing version of ChatGPT, it's not of ChatGPT, but it's equivalent of ChatGPT that produces images. An early version of that, I think it was Midjourney 3 or 4, produced images that won contests, won art contests, where the judges had no idea that the image was created by a computer, by an AI, and was judged against images produced by artists, human artists. So at least in the realms of advertising and image creation, you can see obvious uses for AI, but it extends well beyond that. It's being used massively in the realm of science. It's being used to understand scans of stars. Scientists are able to understand the night sky and interpret which stars are quasars far more easily with the help of AI than they would with a human. I read a study today where scientists were able to take an analysis of star charts that would have taken 82 years for humans to do, and AI did it in a few minutes and was able to detect quasars in that way. That is massively helpful. That is just so useful. And the applications go on and on. Some people have argued that AI is unable to produce good fiction writing. And I don't think that's true. As a writer myself, as a science fiction author, I've been very impressed with the way that ChatGPT is able to plot and create character arcs. In the early versions of ChatGPT, there was a token problem. Basically, ChatGPT couldn't remember more than a certain number of characters or words or word parts. So a token is a word part. It had a memory problem. That memory problem is pretty much gone now. ChatGPT is able to memorize enormous lengths of writing, and it's increasing all the time. Very soon, ChatGPT will be able to imbibe a whole library of books and remember all of it in one chat. So in the past, it couldn't produce a novel without forgetting at the end of the novel what was written at the beginning, but that is no longer the case. The applications of AI are enormous, and people just don't seem to understand that. So these are just the ways in which people's understanding of reality seems to be warped, people who are against AI, when they say, well, it's just not useful. But they also seem to be very confused about how it works. So they think that it's just sort of a statistical regurgitation machine. So they think that it just takes the most common sentences and finds the most common words that occur after that. And yes, that's sort of true in some very limited sense, but no more so than it is true for humans. So if you think about how you learn about language and how you learn about the way the world works, you are also pattern recognition machines. And to say that because a computer is operating according to similar principles means that that computer is what? Not intelligent, that it has no creativity, which are both claims that have been made on our show by certain guests, is really missing the point. Because if you claim that about computers, you've got to believe it about people too, because people operate in the same way. And then finally, this issue around the ethics of AI, people saying that it's unethical. And there seem to be many arguments for this. So the one argument is that it's stealing people's work to learn from. But it seems like the way that AI learns from people's work is not by simply regurgitating that work verbatim. What it does is it takes it in and digests it and then produces something that's a combination of elements of all the pieces of work, plus some randomness involved, plus some intelligent creativity that gets thrown in. And that seems, again, to be just the way we all learn as human beings. Am I plagiarizing when I walk into an art gallery and get inspired by the styles of the artists that I see and then go home and paint a painting in the same style? Am I plagiarizing by doing that? Of course I'm not plagiarizing by doing that. Suppose that my memory was perfect and that I really could recall perfectly those images in my mind, and I had this incredible skill to reproduce very strikingly similar images myself. Would I then be plagiarizing? Of course not. So it just seems like there's these weird ethical objections around plagiarism. There's other ethical objections around AI taking the jobs of human beings. And that's odd as well, right? I mean, it seems like that same Luddite argument has been raised throughout history to argue against the printing press, against the invention of computers, calculators. And I just think that every person who has raised these objections in the past has been on the wrong side of history. Rather get on board, than say, well, this is just objectionable. Because this is happening whether you like it or not. The printing press happened whether you like it or not. Industrialization happened whether you like it or not. And AI is happening whether you like it or not.